There are places in America where time seems to have stopped moving. Not because of ghosts or curses, nor because of anything that defies nature or reason, but because of something far more unsettling, the deliberate, methodical erasure of truth. The kind of erasure that demands not just one person's silence, but the complicity of an entire community. The kind of silence that can only be sustained when everyone involved understands that speaking would destroy not just one life, but many. In a remote corner of Mississippi, on the edge of what was once a prosperous plantation, stood a cabin that no one entered for 40 years. Not 40 months, not 40 weeks, 40 years. For decades of deliberate abandonment. For decades during which the door remained locked, the windows remained shuttered, and the surrounding community maintained a silence so profound, so binding, that it became almost sacred. The cabin itself was unremarkable to look at: weathered cypress wood, a sagging roof, a single chimney leaning slightly east like a tired old man. By 1911, when a surveyor finally forced the door open, it had become little more than a shell, a hollow thing, emptied of whatever purpose it had once served. But what he found inside would raise questions that historians would struggle to answer for more than a century. Questions about what the wealthy family had hidden. Questions about why an entire community had agreed to forget. Questions about what kind of desperation, what kind of fear, what kind of terrible knowledge could bind people to such a suffocating and profound silence. This is the story of that cabin and the 40 years leading up to its opening. This is the story of a family that chose to erase someone from existence and a community that chose to help them do it. To understand what happened in that cabin, we must first understand the world in which it was built. We must understand Mississippi in the years before the Civil War, a state that was, in many ways, the heart of the American South's greatest sin and greatest wealth. The rich family arrived in Mississippi in 1831, during a period of rapid expansion. The cotton boom was in full force. Land that had been wilderness just years before was being cleared, cultivated, and transformed into vast plantations that generated enormous wealth. It was a time of opportunity for those with capital and ambition. It was a time of unimaginable suffering for those who were enslaved. Thomas Rich was not a man of exceptional ambition or exceptional cruelty. By the standards of his time and place, he was relatively ordinary. He had come to Mississippi from Tennessee with modest capital, perhaps $5,000, a significant sum, but not a fortune. He had purchased 300 acres in a county that would later become known for its isolation and fierce independence from state authority. The land was good for cotton. Cotton meant profit, and profit meant status. By 1840, Thomas Rich had established himself as a moderately successful planter. He had built a modest but respectable plantation house, a two-story structure with wide porches, designed in the style that was becoming common among Mississippi's middle-class agricultural elite. It was not the grand mansion of the great planters, but it was respectable. It announced to the world that Thomas Rich was a man of means, a man of standing, a man who had succeeded in the great American enterprise of the 19th century. Around the main house, he had constructed the necessary outbuildings: a smokehouse for preserving meat, a barn for storing crops and equipment, storage facilities for cotton and other goods, and the quarters where enslaved people lived and worked. By 1850, Thomas Rich owned approximately 40 enslaved people. It was a moderate-sized workforce, enough to generate significant profit, but not so large as to require the elaborate management structure maintained by the great planters. Thomas Rich married in 1832. His wife was Sarah Hutchkins, the daughter of a neighboring planter. It was a marriage of convenience and mutual benefit, as most marriages among the planter class were. Sarah came from a family with connections and modest wealth. Thomas brought ambition and a willingness to work. Together they built a life that, by the standards of the time, was successful and respectable. Between 1833 and 1850, Sarah gave birth to 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were William, James, Robert, and Thomas Jr. The daughters were Catherine and Margaret. They were born into a world of privilege and comfort, a world built on the labor and suffering of enslaved people, but a world they would never question or examine. It was simply the world as it was. It was simply the natural order of things. William, the eldest son, was born in 1833. He grew up during the height of the cotton boom, when Mississippi seemed to be the center of the American universe. He was educated, as much as education was available in rural Mississippi, in the classics and the principles of plantation management. He learned to ride, to shoot, to manage enslaved workers, to conduct business. He learned to see himself as a member of an elite class, a class destined to rule, a class justified in its dominion over others. James, the second son, was born in 1835. He was quieter than William, more introspective. He showed an aptitude for numbers and business, and his father began grooming him to manage the plantation's finances. He was less comfortable with the social aspects of planter life, less interested in the hunting, drinking, and political maneuvering that occupied so much of his older brother's time. Robert, the third son, was born in 1838. He was the most volatile of the three older sons, prone to anger and impulsiveness. He seemed to absorb the racial ideology of the South more completely than his brothers, as if he needed to prove his commitment to the system more forcefully than others. Thomas Jr., the youngest son, was born in 1845. He was only 16 when the Civil War began, and only 20 when it ended. He was the only one of the sons who might have grown up in a different world had circumstances been different. Catherine, the elder daughter, was born in 1836. She was raised to be a wife and mother, to manage a household and maintain social status. She was educated in the accomplishments considered appropriate for young women of her class: music, drawing, needlework, conversation. She was expected to marry well, to marry a man of status and means, to produce heirs who would continue the family line. Margaret, the younger daughter, was born in 1838. She was Catherine's shadow in many ways, following the same path, learning the same lessons, preparing for the same future. This was the rich family in the years before the Civil War, a family of moderate means but significant status, a family that was successful by the standards of their time, a family that had everything to lose if the system that supported them were to collapse. And then in 1860, Thomas Rich built the cabin. The cabin was different from the other structures on the property. It was set apart, nearly a quarter-mile from the main house, positioned at the edge of the property where the cultivated land gave way to dense forest. It was smaller than the slave quarters, but more solidly constructed than any of the other outbuildings. It had a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. It had a single window that faced away from the main house, positioned so that anyone inside could see out toward the forest, but anyone outside could not easily see in. When neighbors asked about the cabin, Thomas Rich offered vague explanations. It was for storage, he said. Or perhaps for a caretaker. Or perhaps for a guest house. The explanations changed depending on who asked and what he thought they wanted to hear. But the explanations were never quite satisfactory. There was something about the cabin that seemed wrong, something about its construction and its location that suggested a purpose not being openly acknowledged. Some neighbors speculated that it was a place where Thomas Rich kept a mistress. This was not uncommon among planters, and it would have been a scandal, but not a shocking one. Others suggested that it was a punishment house, a place where enslaved people who had misbehaved were kept in isolation. This too was not uncommon, though it was not something openly discussed. But no one asked too many questions, and Thomas Rich did not volunteer any information. The cabin stood at the edge of the property, locked and mysterious, and the community learned to accept its existence without understanding its purpose. In 1861, the Civil War began for Mississippi and for the Rich family. Everything changed. William Rich, the eldest son, was 28 years old when the war began. He enlisted in the Confederate Army almost immediately. He was commissioned as a captain, a rank reflecting his family's status and his own education. He saw combat in several major battles. He was wounded twice, once in the shoulder, once in the leg. He survived the war, but survival came at a cost. Something inside him had broken, something damaged in a way that could not be repaired. James Rich, the second son, was 26 when the war began. He did not enlist. Instead, he remained on the plantation, managing the family's affairs as best he could. The war made this increasingly difficult. As the Union Army advanced deeper into Mississippi, the plantation became less secure. Enslaved people began to flee, seeking freedom with Union forces. The cotton crop became harder to harvest and harder to sell. The wealth that had seemed so secure began to evaporate. Robert Rich, the third son, was 22 when the war began. He enlisted in the Confederate Army, but he saw less combat than William. He spent much of the war in garrison duty, away from the major battles. When the war ended, he returned to Mississippi with his ideology intact, but his prospects diminished. Thomas Jr., the youngest son, was only 15 when the war began. He was too young to enlist, but old enough to understand what was happening. He watched his older brothers leave. He watched the plantation's enslaved workers flee. He watched his father struggle to maintain control of a system collapsing around him. Sarah Rich, the mother, spent the war years managing the household as best she could. She watched her sons leave for war. She watched the family's wealth diminish. She watched the world she had known disappear. By the time the war ended, she was a different woman, older, more tired, more haunted by the knowledge of what had been lost. Catherine and Margaret, the daughters, spent the war years in a state of increasing anxiety. Their prospects for advantageous marriages had been built on the assumption that the plantation system would continue indefinitely. As the war progressed and the Confederate cause became increasingly hopeless, those prospects diminished. They faced the possibility of spinsterhood, of poverty, of a future that looked nothing like the future they had been promised. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Rich family had survived, but they had lost much. They had lost the enslaved people who had formed the foundation of their wealth. They had lost the cotton market that had generated their income. They had lost the social order that had justified their status. They had lost the future they had imagined for themselves. And they had gained something else, a terrible knowledge of what they had been part of, what they had benefited from, what they had lost. In the months after the war ended, Mississippi was in chaos. The state was occupied by Union troops. The plantation system was collapsing. Formerly enslaved people were attempting to build new lives, to find family members from whom they had been separated, to claim some measure of freedom and dignity. The white population was in shock, struggling to adapt to a new reality in which they no longer held absolute power. It was in this context of chaos and upheaval that something happened at the Rich plantation, something that would set in motion a chain of events that would define the next 4 decades of the family's existence. The historical record is silent on the specifics. There is no official account of what occurred. There are no contemporary documents that explain what happened. But the consequences are undeniable, and they are recorded in the historical record for anyone willing to look carefully enough. In the summer of 1866, a young woman appeared at the Rich plantation. The records do not clearly indicate who she was or where she came from. Some accounts suggest she was a distant relative, a cousin from Tennessee or Georgia. Other accounts suggest she was the daughter of a neighboring family. Still others suggest something more complicated, something that was never fully explained. What is certain is that she was young, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old. What is certain is that she was living in the main house by the summer of 1866. And what is certain is that her presence at the plantation created a disruption in the household that would have profound consequences. Her name, according to the few records that mention her at all, was Ellalinina. Ellalinina's arrival at the Rich plantation in the summer of 1866 was noted by the community but not remarked upon. In the chaos of Reconstruction, the arrival of a young relative or family friend was not unusual. People were constantly moving, constantly seeking refuge with relatives or connections, constantly attempting to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. What was unusual was Ellalinina's status in the household. She was not treated as a servant. She was not treated as a poor relation who had come seeking charity. She was treated in many ways as a member of the family. She ate at the family table. She was included in family conversations. She was given a room in the main house, not in the servants' quarters. This unusual status created tension in the household. The servants noticed it. The neighbors noticed it. There was something about Ellalinina's presence that seemed to disrupt the normal order of things. William Rich, who had returned from the war broken and traumatized, seemed to take a particular interest in Ellalinina. He spent time with her. He spoke to her. He seemed to find in her company some kind of solace or distraction from the demons that haunted him. James Rich, the more reserved of the older sons, seemed to view Evelina with suspicion. He asked questions about her background, about her family, about why she had come to the plantation. The answers he received were vague and unsatisfying. Robert Rich seemed to view Evelina with a mixture of interest and resentment. He watched her interactions with William with a kind of jealous intensity. Thomas Jr., the youngest son, was largely indifferent to Evelina's presence. He was too young to fully understand the dynamics playing out around him. Catherine and Margaret, the daughters, seemed to view Evelina with a combination of curiosity and weariness. She was close to their age, but she was not quite one of them. She was not quite a servant, but she was not quite a family member either. She occupied an ambiguous space in the household hierarchy. Sarah Rich, the mother, seemed to tolerate Evelina's presence but not to welcome it. She was polite to the young woman, but there was a distance in her politeness, a coldness that suggested disapproval or concern. In the months following Evelina's arrival, the tension in the household increased. There were arguments between the sons. There were whispered conversations between Sarah and Thomas Rich. There were looks exchanged that suggested something was wrong. Something was being hidden. Something was being decided. And then in the winter of 1866, Evelina disappeared. She was no longer seen in the household. She was no longer present at family meals. She was no longer visible in the community. When neighbors asked about her, the explanations offered were vague. She had gone to live with relatives in another state, Thomas Rich said. She had decided to return to her family, Sarah Rich explained. The explanations were accepted without question, but Evelina never appeared in any census records in any other state. She never married. She never had children. She never appeared in any public record again. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. What had happened to Evelina? The historical record does not say, but what we know is that shortly after her disappearance, the cabin at the edge of the property was locked. The door was secured with a heavy padlock. The windows were shuttered, and the cabin became a place that no one was allowed to enter. In the years following Evelina's disappearance, the Rich family's behavior became increasingly erratic. Thomas Rich, the patriarch, seemed to withdraw from community life. He spent more time managing his property and less time socializing with his neighbors. He stopped attending church regularly. He stopped participating in the social gatherings that were an important part of planter society. When he did venture into town, he seemed anxious, distracted. He would conduct his business quickly and return to the plantation. He seemed to be avoiding conversations, avoiding questions, avoiding any situation in which he might be asked about his family or his household. Sarah Rich became reclusive. She was rarely seen in town. When she did appear, neighbors noted that she seemed anxious, distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. She seemed to have aged significantly in just a few years. The vibrant woman who had once been a fixture of social life in the county had become a shadow of herself. The sons seemed to be engaged in some kind of internal conflict. William and James, who had once been close, began to avoid each other. When they were forced to interact, there was a tension between them that was palpable, almost dangerous. Robert seemed withdrawn and moody, prone to sudden rages that seemed to come from nowhere. Thomas Jr., the youngest, seemed to be growing up in an atmosphere of tension and unspoken conflict, learning to be silent, learning to ask no questions, learning to accept the strange rules that governed his family. Catherine and Margaret, the daughters, seemed to have given up on their prospects for advantageous marriages. They remained unmarried, living in the main house, their futures increasingly uncertain. They seemed to have become trapped in the household, unable to escape, unable to build lives of their own. And the cabin remained locked. The community's response to all of this was remarkable in its passivity. Neighbors noticed that the Rich family seemed smaller. They noticed that certain family members were no longer seen in public. They noticed that Evelina had disappeared. But they did not ask questions. They did not investigate. They accepted the explanations offered, vague references to relatives living elsewhere, to family members who had moved away, to circumstances that were nobody's business but the family's own. This acceptance was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate choice by the community to look away. And that choice was rooted in something deeper than mere politeness or respect for privacy. It was rooted in fear. By the 1870s, Mississippi was a state in turmoil. Reconstruction had brought federal troops, federal authority, and a fundamental challenge to the social order that had existed before the Civil War. In this context, the rich family's behavior, whatever it was, became something the community had a vested interest in ignoring. If the rich family was hiding something, then the community's silence was a form of protection. It was a way of maintaining the fiction that the old world could be preserved, that the old hierarchies could be maintained, that the past could be kept locked away in a cabin at the edge of the property. It was a way of saying, we do not want to know. We do not want to see. We do not want to be forced to acknowledge what might be happening here. And in exchange for that silence, we expect you to extend the same courtesy to us. We expect you to look away from our own secrets, our own sins, our own complicity in the system that has collapsed around us. And so the silence held, year after year, decade after decade. The community maintained its collective agreement to see nothing, to know nothing, to say nothing. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, always has a cost. In 1867, something changed. The historical record becomes unclear at this point, which is itself significant. Census records from that year show the rich family household as having 7 members. But in 1870, the census shows only 6. No death certificate was filed. No explanation was offered. The missing person was simply gone from the official record, as if they had never existed. Over the next 40 years, this pattern would repeat with disturbing regularity. In 1880, the census showed 5 family members. In 1890, 4. In 1900, 3. Each time, a family member disappeared from the record. Each time, no explanation was given. Each time, the community seemed to accept the absence without question. But who was disappearing? The historical record is vague on this point, but certain patterns emerge when the census data is examined carefully. In 1867, the missing person appears to have been one of the daughters, Catherine or Margaret. The records are not entirely clear. One of the daughters simply ceased to exist in the official record. She was no longer listed as a member of the household. She was no longer counted as a living person, but she did not leave the plantation. Neighbors who visited the main house reported seeing a young woman in the windows, a young woman who seemed to be watching the world outside but not participating in it. In 1880, another family member disappeared from the record. This time it appears to have been one of the sons, Robert perhaps, or possibly Thomas Jr. again. The person did not leave the plantation. They were still there, living in the main house, but they were no longer counted. They had become invisible. In 1890, another disappearance. And in 1900, another. The pattern was clear. The rich family was deliberately removing family members from the official record. They were making people invisible. They were erasing them from history. But why? What purpose could this possibly serve? One possibility is that the family was attempting to hide the existence of people who had become a burden or an embarrassment. Perhaps one of the daughters had become pregnant out of wedlock. Perhaps one of the sons had become mentally ill or disabled. Perhaps one of the family members had become involved in some kind of scandal or crime. By removing them from the official record, the family could pretend that they did not exist. They could maintain the fiction that the family was smaller, more respectable, more normal than it actually was. Another possibility is that the family was attempting to hide the existence of people who had become a threat to the family's secrets. Perhaps Evelina had not actually disappeared. Perhaps she had been hidden away in the cabin, kept in isolation, prevented from speaking to anyone outside the family. And perhaps over the years, other people had learned about Evelina, had become a threat to the family's carefully maintained silence, and had been similarly hidden away. But these are only possibilities. The truth, whatever it was, had been locked away in that cabin for so long that it had become impossible to recover. What we do know is that the rich family was willing to engage in a systematic falsification of official records in order to maintain their secrets. They were willing to erase people from history. They were willing to make human beings invisible. And the community was willing to help them do it. In 1880, a new element entered the story. A lawyer from the county seat, a man named Harrington, came to the rich plantation on business. The nature of his business is not recorded, but it had something to do with property disputes or boundary issues, the kind of mundane legal matters common in rural Mississippi. Harrington was a man of the new order. He had come to Mississippi after the war, seeking opportunity in a state struggling to rebuild itself. He was not bound by the old social codes that had governed the antebellum South. He was not a native of Mississippi. He did not have family connections to the old planter families. He was willing to ask questions that others would not ask, and he was willing to pursue answers that others would not pursue. During his visit to the plantation, Harrington noticed something that others had learned to overlook: the cabin. It was impossible not to notice it, really. It stood at the edge of the property, locked and shuttered, clearly separated from the other buildings. It was the kind of structure that naturally provoked curiosity. Harrington asked about it. Thomas Rich offered the usual vague explanation. It was for storage, he said, or perhaps for a caretaker. Harrington was not satisfied. He pressed for more information. He asked when it had been built. He asked what it was used for. He asked why it was locked. Thomas Rich became evasive. His answers became vaguer. He seemed to become uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Harrington became insistent. He demanded to know what was in the cabin. Thomas Rich refused to allow him to enter. Harrington threatened legal action. He suggested that if the cabin contained something that needed to be hidden, then perhaps the authorities should be informed. The confrontation between the two men was brief but significant. It took place in the main house in the presence of family members. Thomas Rich's face became red with anger. His voice became harsh. He made statements that would later be recorded in a deposition, statements that suggested a depth of desperation and fear that went far beyond what would be expected from a simple storage building. "There are some things that are better left alone," Thomas Rich said. Some doors that should not be opened. Some truths that would destroy more than they would reveal. If you value your life, if you value your reputation, if you value your ability to conduct business in this county, you will forget about that cabin. You will forget that you ever asked about it, and you will never speak of this conversation to anyone. Harrington left the plantation without entering the cabin, but he did not forget the encounter, and he did not abandon his curiosity. Over the next few years, Harrington began to investigate the Rich family's history. He examined census records. He looked for death certificates. He interviewed neighbors. He spoke to people who had worked on the plantation. He attempted to piece together a picture of what had happened to the family over the past 15 years. What he found was a pattern of disappearances that could not be easily explained: family members who had vanished from the official record, relatives who had supposedly moved away but left no trace of their departure, a household that seemed to be shrinking year by year despite the fact that no one had died. Harrington's investigation was not conducted in secret. He asked questions openly. He made his suspicions known. He spoke to other lawyers about the legal implications of what he had discovered. He suggested that the Rich family might be engaged in some kind of fraud, some kind of falsification of official records. And the community's response was swift and decisive. Harrington was ostracized. He was no longer welcome in polite society. Business associates began to distance themselves from him. His reputation was damaged. The message was clear: some questions should not be asked. Some mystery should not be investigated. Harrington attempted to pursue the matter through official channels. He spoke to the county clerk about the inconsistencies in the census records. He suggested that an investigation should be launched. But the county clerk was not interested. The county clerk was a man who had lived in Mississippi his entire life. He understood the unwritten rules. He understood that some things were better left alone. Harrington eventually gave up. He realized that he could not pursue the matter without the support of the community. And the community had made it clear that they did not want the matter pursued. He realized that his own reputation and his ability to conduct business in the county were being threatened by his continued investigation. In 1885, Harrington left Mississippi. He moved to another state, where he attempted to build a new life. He became a successful lawyer in his new home. He married, had children, built a respectable life, but he never forgot the cabin, and he never stopped wondering about what was hidden inside. Years later, near the end of his life, Harrington would write a letter to a friend, a letter that would eventually be discovered and published in a historical journal. In the letter, he described his investigation of the Rich family and his conviction that something terrible had happened in that cabin. He described the family's desperate attempts to hide the truth. He described the community's complicity in maintaining the silence. And he expressed his regret that he had not been able to uncover the truth, that he had not been able to bring the matter to light. "I have often wondered," he wrote, "whether my decision to abandon the investigation was a wise one or a cowardly one. I have wondered whether I should have pressed harder, demanded more answers, refused to accept the silence. But I was a young man then, and I was afraid. I was afraid of what I might discover. I was afraid of what the community might do to me if I continued to ask questions. And I was afraid of what might happen if the truth were revealed." Sometimes I think that fear was justified. Sometimes I think that some truths are too terrible to be revealed, that some doors are better left closed. But most of the time I think that I was simply a coward, and that my cowardice allowed a terrible injustice to continue. In 1908, a new threat to the family's secret emerged. A young journalist from Jackson, the state capital, became interested in the Rich family's history. His name was Edward Crane, and he was working on a series of articles about the history of Mississippi's plantation families. He was attempting to document the lives of the families who had built their wealth on slavery, to examine how they had adapted to the collapse of the plantation system, to explore the social and economic changes that had transformed Mississippi in the decades following the Civil War. Crane was a talented journalist. He was intelligent, persistent, and not easily discouraged. He had heard rumors about the Rich family, vague stories about disappearances, about family members who had vanished, about a locked cabin that no one was allowed to enter. He had read Harrington's letter, which had been published in a historical journal. He had become convinced that there was a story here, a real story, a story that deserved to be told. Crane began to investigate. He examined public records. He interviewed people who had known the Rich family. He traveled to the plantation and attempted to interview the family members who were still living. What he found was a wall of silence. The family refused to speak to him. The community refused to cooperate with his investigation. Doors were closed to him. Interviews were canceled. He was made to understand, in no uncertain terms, that his questions were not welcome. But Crane was persistent. He continued to investigate despite the obstacles. He published preliminary articles that hinted at a mystery without revealing its nature. The articles generated interest among readers. People began to ask questions. The silence that had held for so long was beginning to crack. In one of his articles, Crane wrote, "There is a family in Mississippi whose history is shrouded in mystery. Census records show a pattern of disappearances that cannot be easily explained. Family members vanish from the official record, yet they do not leave the plantation. They do not appear in other states. They do not marry or have children. They simply cease to exist in the eyes of the law. What is the explanation for this pattern? What is the family hiding? And why is the community so determined to protect their secret?" The article generated significant interest. People began to speculate about the Rich family. Theories began to circulate. Some people suggested that the family was engaged in some kind of fraud. Others suggested that they were hiding something far more sinister. Still others suggested that the family members who had disappeared had been murdered, and that the family was covering up the crime. The Rich family and their allies in the community took action. They used their remaining influence to pressure the newspaper to stop publishing Crane's articles. They threatened advertisers. They questioned Crane's credibility and his motives. They suggested that he was a carpetbagger, an outsider who did not understand the ways of Mississippi society. They suggested that he was attempting to stir up trouble, to create conflict where none existed, to damage the reputation of respectable families for the sake of selling newspapers. The pressure worked. The newspaper's editor, facing economic and social pressure, decided to stop publishing Crane's articles. Crane was forced to abandon his investigation. He left Mississippi and eventually left journalism altogether. He moved to another state and attempted to build a new life. His articles were forgotten. The mystery remained unsolved. But Crane, like Harrington before him, never forgot the cabin. And he never stopped wondering about what was hidden inside. In his later years, Crane would attempt to return to the story, to publish a book about the rich family and the mystery of the locked cabin. But by that time, most of the people who had known the family were dead. The plantation had been sold. The main house had been demolished. The evidence had been scattered or destroyed. Crane's book was never published. His investigation was never completed. In 1890, Thomas Rich died. He was 78 years old. His death was noted in the local newspaper with the kind of respectful obituary that was standard for men of his station. But there was something notable about the obituary: it did not list all of his children. It mentioned only those who were still living in the household and still counted in the official record. The others, the ones who had disappeared from the census records, were not mentioned at all. It was as if they had never existed. After Thomas Rich's death, the management of the plantation fell to his eldest son, William. William was now in his 50s, a man who had lived through the Civil War, the collapse of the plantation system, and 4 decades of maintaining a terrible secret. He continued his father's policy of silence. The cabin remained locked. The family members who had disappeared from the official record continued to live in the main house, but they continued to be invisible to the outside world. The community continued to accept this arrangement without question. The silence held. William was not a well man. He suffered from what the doctors of the time called nervous exhaustion, likely a form of depression or psychological trauma. He spent much of his time in the main house, rarely venturing out. He seemed to be haunted by something, pursued by demons that no one could see. He drank heavily. He slept poorly. He seemed to be a man who was being slowly destroyed by the weight of the secrets he carried. In 1905, William Rich died. He was 74 years old. The management of the plantation passed to his brother, James, who was now in his 60s. James was the last of the original sons who had been old enough to remember the antebellum world. He was also the last person who had direct knowledge of what had happened in the cabin. James was not a well man either. He suffered from the same kind of nervous exhaustion that had plagued his brother. He spent much of his time in the main house, rarely venturing out. The plantation was managed by hired hands. The family's affairs were increasingly handled by lawyers and business associates. And still the cabin remained locked. The plantation was no longer profitable. The land was being divided and sold off. The family's wealth was diminishing. The main house was deteriorating. The community that had once protected the family's secret was changing. New people were moving in. Old people were dying. The bonds of silence were weakening. It was in this context of decline and change that the cabin would finally be opened. It was in this context that the secret that had been so carefully guarded for 40 years would finally be exposed. But the exposure would come too late. The people who knew the truth were either dead or unwilling to speak. The evidence had been scattered or destroyed. The mystery would remain unsolved. In 1911, 45 years after Evelina's disappearance, a surveyor named Henry Caldwell came to the property. He had been hired to assess the remaining land for potential sale. The plantation was being broken up and sold off in pieces. The family's wealth had been dissipated. The era of the great plantations was over. As Caldwell was conducting his survey, he noticed the cabin. It was impossible not to notice it. It stood at the edge of the property, locked and shuttered, clearly separated from the other buildings. It was the kind of structure that naturally provoked curiosity. Caldwell asked about it. The family members who were still living on the property, now reduced to just 2 or 3 people, offered the usual vague explanations. It was for storage, they said. Or perhaps for a caretaker. Or perhaps it had been used for some other purpose that they could no longer remember. But Caldwell was not satisfied. He was a practical man, a man of the new century, not bound by the old social codes. He demanded access to the cabin. The family refused. Caldwell threatened to involve the authorities. He suggested that if the cabin contained something that needed to be hidden, then perhaps the authorities should be informed. He suggested that there might be legal implications to the family's refusal to allow him to inspect the property. The family, now too weak to resist, relented. They gave Caldwell the key to the cabin, or perhaps they simply allowed him to force the door open. The historical record is unclear on this point. On a day in March 1911, Henry Caldwell opened the door of the cabin for the first time in 45 years. What he found inside would be the subject of speculation and controversy for more than a century. The cabin was not empty. It contained evidence of habitation. There were beds. There were personal items. There were signs that people had lived there for extended periods over many years. But there was no one inside. The cabin had been abandoned, but not recently. It had been abandoned years ago, perhaps decades ago. The beds were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses. The bedding was old and deteriorated. There were blankets, but they were threadbare and falling apart. There were pillows, but they were nearly empty of stuffing. On the walls, there were marks, scratches, gouges, as if something had been dragged across the wood repeatedly, or as if someone had clawed at the walls trying to escape. There was a chamber pot in one corner, old and stained. There was a bucket for water. There was a small table with a few dishes and cups. There was a shelf with some books, old books, their pages yellowed and brittle. There was a fireplace, but it had not been used in many years. The hearth was cold and empty. And there was a window, the single window that faced away from the main house. It was boarded up from the inside, blocking out the light, blocking out any view of the outside world. Caldwell immediately reported his findings to the authorities. An investigation was launched. The family was questioned, but